So, just some of the headlines in the last few weeks. In the UK, the Competitions and Markets Authority has been investigating Apple over suspected anti-competitive behaviour. This is regarding their terms and conditions, which price out app developers essentially and force them to use the Apple payment system, where they can take a huge commission. So there they are using their size and their dominance in the smartphone market to not allow app developers to compete with them, because Apple makes a huge amount of money even when the app developers make money. In the US, Facebook is being sued by 45 states and the District of Columbia over antitrust, which is basically monopoly. So because they own Instagram and they also own WhatsApp, they are dominating right now the social media game, and the US government doesn't like it. Certainly not this new democratic government that's just come in. In the EU, Amazon facing similar allegations that they have been using their third-party data to essentially steal clients from their sellers, which use their marketplace. So because Amazon is a retailer as well as a marketplace, they've been able to use the data on the customers for their third-party sellers to advance their own product lines. Now, all of these allegations are broadly allegations of anti-competitive behavior. So they're companies that are massive, obviously, and they are using their enormous size to not allow anyone else to compete with them. And this is a form of monopoly. So I don't know, I'm sure you've all played Monopoly. It's not very fun. Basically, one guy gets a little bit ahead, and then once he's bigger than the rest of you, there's nothing you can do. You can't compete with this guy. He just keeps putting hotels on everything, and you can't afford to pay rent, and you slowly lose the game. So that's the same thing that these guys are basically accused of doing. They're using their huge size to not allow anyone to compete, and it's a serious problem. So why is it a problem? To explain some of the disadvantages of monopolies, it helps to go back in time to some of the early examples which led to the current legislation that we see today. So we've got Standard Oil and US Steel in the early 1900s in America. Standard Oil held at one stage a 90% market share for oil in the US, and it means that they didn't have to compete with anyone. No other oil company could match their volume. Customers didn't really have a choice who they got their oil from, and so Standard Oil could do whatever they want, like raise the price. Normally, in a marketplace, if you raise your prices, we've talked about this before, people will go elsewhere, they'll buy from the other guy who's selling for less. But when there is no other guy, you're able to just raise the prices arbitrarily, and this is bad for the consumer or the purchaser. Similarly for steel. It also disincentivizes innovation. So this doesn't so much apply to these two companies, which are essentially raw materials companies, but companies which have monopolies don't have to compete with anyone. They don't have to advance their product lines to stand out from the market. So it means that they don't innovate as well. And again, this is bad for the consumer. We don't get to see new products every year. We don't get more for our money every year. So this is another disadvantage of monopoly. We also can see quality slippage. So for US Steel, for example, they don't have to necessarily assure that they have the best quality steel on the market to stand out from their competitors, because they're the monopoly. There's no one else to go to. They can make steel as cheaply as they want and charge the same thing. And if the steel's rubbish, well, it's the best available because they're the only one in the market. So essentially, all of these disadvantages come down to the market being less efficient when there is a monopoly at play. When the free market is at its best, you've got many different competitors, all trying to stand out from the market, all trying to give consumers the best possible deal so that they can earn their market share. But you can see that efficiency really starts to slip when you have a monopoly. So back in the day, the government looked at this in America and they said, we can't have it. And they broke up these companies, so there was no longer a monopoly. Now, back to the tech stocks of today, we can see that not all of these advantages necessarily apply. Disadvantages, sorry. Facebook and Google run free-to-use platforms, so a price hike for them would be a fundamental restructuring of the business, and it wouldn't be something that consumers didn't really have a choice in. They could easily not pay for the previously free-to-use platform, so there's no danger of prices going up in that regard. Similarly, all of these companies are constantly innovating, so we don't see that problem. Apple, you could argue, has been accused of maybe making subpar products so that their customers are forced to buy more, but that's beside the point. But Amazon and Apple especially, but Google and Facebook as well, really don't have a monopoly in any one market. They're seen as monopolies because they are huge in many different markets. Amazon is a retailer. It provides web services. It's a streaming giant. It's a marketplace. So it's huge in lots of different areas. And same with Apple. It's in TV, it's in phones, it's in computers. Google, Facebook speaks for itself. So these guys are considered monopolies more on their huge size than their dominant market share necessarily. So why is it still such a problem? Well, we have to also recognize the different role that companies play in our modern society compared to early in the 1900s when these antitrust laws were made. And these companies provide us our information, right? Especially Google and Facebook. This is where the world gets its information and where we share our information. So for a few companies to completely dominate those markets, it can be a dangerous thing. And we've already seen in recent years this kind of thing start to happen. YouTube has been asked to curb conspiracy theories on their platform, so they no longer show those to you, even if the algorithm suggests it. Donald Trump had his run-ins with Twitter over the last couple of years when he wasn't typing Covfefe. And Instagram also has been held to an account for fact-checking. This all seems harmless and probably good, but it is a new stage in these tech companies where they are now editorializing. And it does mean that they've set the precedent now where these companies can decide what information we are and are not allowed to see. And it could be a dangerous thing for just a few companies to be able to restrict the information that almost the whole world is able to access. So it's a real concern for governments going forward that these monopolies don't exist. So we've talked a bit about the disadvantages now, but what do we think of this all as investors? Well, when we look at the companies, we can see great numbers across the board. It's no surprise, really. These guys didn't get to the top by being mediocre. All of them especially show fantastic growth rates. In the equity department, you can see Facebook 53%, Netflix 44%. It's really a growth industry. Tech has always been a growth industry. So when we're looking at all these governments and political institutions taking notice of the huge size of these companies and not really liking it, that speaks to there possibly being a problem for the forward long-term growth of these companies. If at every turn these companies face legislation, every time they try and grow, it's going to be harder to keep this growth up. So as investors, as lead pass investors, we can look at these and especially look at Google and say, well, these numbers are fantastic across the board. I want to start looking at the competitive advantage, start looking at the management. But one of the other things we'll have to consider when we do all that research is, are they anti-competitive? How do governments view this company? And we'll talk more about this with Google next week, but it's definitely something to consider. So I hope that information was useful. Thank you, and are there any questions?